Thanks so much, Adam. And thank you all so much for being here. What an honor to be here for the 10th anniversary panel moderating the fearsome foursome. I don't know, think of good names for them. So excited to get things kicked off here. We'll kick off with some introductions, right? Excited to introduce Blake, Brad, Jen, and Eric. So I'll ask each of them just to give you a background of when were they at MITRE, what did they do, and then what have they done since? As Adam mentioned, I was on the MITRE ATT&CK team a couple years ago. I was at MITRE from 2015 to 2020. I did have to look that up on LinkedIn because time flies. So I had kind of the honor. I still remember when Blake emailed me and was like, hey, do you want to like map some groups to this ATT&CK thing? And I was like, I don't know what it is, but I'm in. So with that, Blake, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so I joined MITRE in 2013 and left in 2020, right before COVID really kicked off. In my time there, I started ATT&CK, led the team that created Caldera, the open source project for adversary emulation, helped start the ATT&CK evaluations program. And then when I left, I went to Microsoft. And since then, I've been leading the Microsoft 365 Defender research teams, both for research and data science, where we're doing some pretty cool stuff like the automated attack disruption that Microsoft recently announced.
Yeah, so I was at MITRE 2010 to 2015. I also had to look it up. And I spent most of my time with the NSA Red Team as my sponsor. So I did a lot of offensive work there. When I left MITRE, I went over to Sony and led their global Red Team for another 5 years. And most recently, the last couple of years, I moved over to try the startup world, which has been an interesting ride. So I'm at Phylum, which is a software supply chain security company trying to handle defensive problems around open source software packages. It's kind of been the last few years for me.
And I'm Jen. I was at MITRE. I did not look this up, but I think it was 2014 to 2017. I was kind of the weird one where I actually had a cyber threat intelligence background, and I was also a Chinese Mandarin linguist. So I was working on some data that ended up being used for ATT&CK that was actually real world attack data that we had all of the logs and sensors and things for. And my job was to basically take the technical logs and turn them into something written that people could read and understand. And when I was doing that, there were a number of times where even though I'd been in the space for a while, I'd have to go to one of the other technical people that wasn't in Intel, but did something that was a little more on the technical side. And I had to say, so when this happens, what does it look like actually on the system? Like when we were putting ATT&CK together, from their perspective, it was like, what are you actually typing? And then when I'm going through logs, when I was doing that, then it was marrying it back to what does this actually look like and what I can see in a log, and trying to figure that out. And I loved it, and that was so much fun. I actually only left because I was selected to be hired. I was the first person that was hired for Unit 42 when I was getting started at Palo Alto Networks. And that just sounded fascinating. It was going to the private sector and totally leaving the government space, but it was doing something that I loved to do and I had experience doing in the government space, which was building threat intelligence teams. So I was like, great, I can, kind of make that leap. And I never really looked back. I was there for 9 years, and then I was laid off, like so many people have been lately in this field, unfortunately. And then I recently was picked up by NetWitness, and I am there to basically do what I did at Unit 42 with their team. So I am really excited and looking forward to it. And
Eric was with MITRE from 2001 to 2014, beginning of 2014. Also on the NSA Red Team for the majority of my time, which is where a lot of the information from the framework came from. Brad and I sort of putting things together initially and tapping into Jen's knowledge and others. After that, I moved on to Sony as a security engineering component, and now serve as the head global security architect for Sony. Jamie mentioned family and people mentioning that. Nobody else has mentioned that, so I'll bring it up. I have two twin 13-year-old boys. They don't know much about ATT&CK. They hear me talking about it. They tell me it sounds violent and I shouldn't deal with it very often. But,
and the name is your fault.
And the name is my fault.
Awesome. Well, good to hear about all the backgrounds. And I, as a threat intel person myself, I love the threat intel plus red team power. And along those lines, for those who don't know, let's talk about the attack origin story. Like it came from somewhere, probably just deep in your brains. So I want to pass it over to Blake. Tell everyone about how did attacks start? How did it begin?
Yeah, so this will take us back to about 2013. So I had just worked at the NSA Threat Operations Center for 3 years as a government civilian, and knew Adam from some of the work that he did there. And it was like really cool. So I was like, okay, I'm ready to move on to something else. And MITRE sounds really cool. I want to go join Adam with his work. And so Dr. Todd Whitbold was the department head at the time, interviewed with him. And he thought my background in like cyber defense and threat intel was really good for this project that they had called the Fort Meade experiment, where they were basically instrumenting the Fort Meade live production network with new instrumentation and analytics to find attacker behavior. And he thought it would be a great fit for the white team lead position, where I'm sort of like liaison between the red team and blue team, and helping the red team sort of craft their what we're calling cyber games, which is like the red on blue actions, to prove that the detections and analytics that the blue team was writing were actually effective. So my first sort of like task on the project was to take the results from the first cyber game that happened like the week before I joined and sort of make sense of it. And so I had to dig into the Splunk analytics, the data, what the red team did, and try to make sense of this. And so you can sort of see the seeds getting planted for what eventually became attack. And so after the first cyber game, I wrote this report and tried to make things make sense between the teams and then to a higher level audience to show that they were actually making progress. And so when we were planning the second cyber game, was really going back to like, hey, like the red team's activities, well, some of it was very similar to adversary behavior that I knew about. There was some very like red teamisms in there, like leaving like flag.txt to say like, oh, I was here, which isn't really like something that an APT would do. So I reached back to Adam, and he sort of like pulled from his knowledge on some of the work that he was doing of like the top 10 TTPs that adversaries were doing. So like things like discovery commands and all these, and certain types of lateral movement and stuff. And so it sort of like started the idea is like, how do we look at threat behavior a different way? Instead of like looking at just the APT1 report and saying like, okay, this actor did these things, but how many other actors also do those things? And so we had this idea where we would take, red team actions, try to drill down into the lowest level, and then compare it with threat intel. So we took this idea to our leadership, said, hey, that's great, gave us some funding under the FMX project. And that's when I created the first spreadsheet.
What does everyone else recall? Did Blake tell it right? What did you miss?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are the bones of it. And then in terms of creating it, I think one thing that's important to note, and he kind of just teased that a little bit with the funding and the project, but we all had other jobs, right? We had our sponsor work that we were really doing with most of our time. So this was kind of, I think another important note for the origin story is this was kind of born out of side work. I mean, this really was just, okay, can we find the time to sit in a conference room all together and build the spreadsheet? The Excel tool is the best tool we have for attacking, right? Use that spreadsheet technology to kind of build this out. And I think that was another key element, was finding the time to all get together and talk through all that and start to throw it down. And then, of course, the logistics of how do we organize this thing, as we still struggle with today, right? Trying to fit everything in and decide where it all belongs. So that was one of my recollections of how it all kind of came together as well.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, honestly. You're actually talking about this the other day. I think it was one of the first times in my life where I was actually in a room, and this is my favorite office of all time because it had a lock on the door, and the lock had a special code, and we required special access to get the code to get into our office. So you couldn't just like wander in there randomly, which was amazing. Highly recommend.
Introverts unite.
Yeah. But it was the first time I'd ever had a chance to just sit with people that worked on a red team and blue team people and things like that. And we all just sat in a room and we're like, all right, let's figure this out. What do we need to know to be able to have one language between all of us? And what we're seeing the adversaries doing, so we can finally actually answer the question. If I had been, my organization had been faced with fill in the blank attack that had been in the news or X APT, how would I know, like truly know, if I would have been protected against it? How could I figure that out? And we came up with ATT&CK, which was using actual real world adversary data from a project Adam was running, and marrying that together with red team and blue team skills and creating a way to communicate all that. And then even more than that, going further with Sticks and Taxi, coming up with a machine readable version of that. So taking long form intelligence that even if, no matter how well we write it for people, there's always a challenge because it is technical by nature. And this took having to have that component out of the question. You could actually just get these feeds that were highly vetted and verified and just import them and use them and know that you could actually answer that question. And it was just so much fun.
So I'm sure it was fun, but probably some challenges. Eric, I'd be curious, your perspectives, especially any challenges in the early days.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of the challenges were convincing myself, at least, that this was going to be something that could be broadly useful. I think we always sort of thought red teams could use it, blue teams could use it. Certainly never thought it would get the community adoption it did. And then, of course, one of the other challenges was naming it, right? As hard as it was to dump that knowledge into a spreadsheet, we sat in a room for hours trying to figure out the name. We couldn't come up with something, and just sort of had the epiphany on the drive in one day coming across the American Legion Bridge. Distinctly remember thinking ATT&CK, and I laid out the acronym. And normally you'd expect the sun to come shining through the clouds. It didn't. Traffic cleared a little bit, so I took that as a good sign. But it was a fun time.
Yeah, that was a challenge. I was actually, it didn't get widely adopted, and people laugh about it now all the time. But my initial way of trying to describe it to people was, it's basically a Mr. Potato Head doll. And it's just a bunch of different pieces, and you can combine them however you want to do the finished product. So it's flexible. And we tried to use that for a while. And that only made sense to me.
Oh, no, it made sense to me, too. So I used that in the slide deck to describe ATT&CK many times. And I remember asking Adam to go fill in for a presentation a couple of times. And he got to the slide and just froze because he didn't know how to describe it. So it was only us two that I think understood what that reference meant.
And so what about the ampersand, right? Eric, was the ampersand, did that come to you in traffic? Now there's a giant ampersand.
It's the one thing I really disliked, I'll admit it. There was an A there beforehand, but the ampersand popped up later. But
yeah, we can blame MITRE lawyers for that.
Yeah.
But it's really easy to find it in a Google search now, so that's good.
Little infringement. So the hashtag breaks on Twitter/X, but we have ampersand pretzels. So the silver linings.
It's worth it.
Yeah.
So I have to imagine the early days, Eric, you mentioned, convincing yourself this could be useful. What do you think were some of the early decisions you made that have led ATT&CK to be so successful, bringing us all here today? What do you think has led to its kind of longevity and usefulness? Blake?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that we keep contributing to it. There is a noticeable presence that the ATT&CK team has had since day one in social media, on Twitter, constant updates, that I think the community saw it and was waiting a little bit to see, is this something that MITRE is going to create and then drop, or create and then maybe they update it every once in a while. But I think it was MITRE's persistence in making sure that it's maintained over time that really sold, I think, the community that we were here for the long term.
Jen, from a threat intel perspective, again, a little bit biased here, but I'm curious, how do you think that relentless perspective of focusing on the adversary has really helped ATT&CK?
I think it was actually the critical piece that we'd been missing in threat intelligence, and it's still the most challenging part to get today, is actual, true, accurate logs of the adversaries actually believe you're compromised, whether you actually are or not. Data, logging data, sensor data, everything, and it was in an environment that we controlled. So we could literally sit there, like watch them like real time, and we would, and just giggle and like do stuff on purpose to mess with them. And that was seriously entertaining. But that was the first time in my entire career I had access to that level of data and the time to devote to it to actually figure out. Like I was literally paid to do nothing but parse through logs and write out like a description explanation for other people. So yeah, and once we had that, then it was, why don't we use this?
Yeah, I do think tying in the threat intel, the red teaming, and other things, and sort of meshing that is one of the reasons it succeeded the way it did, and it was, you know, both enlightening for me coming from red teaming and not seeing that threat intel, but I think it played out where we were able to tell a better story. You know, we each have different perspectives, and I think that we were able to build something that was usable more broadly.
Yeah, we had a lot of, but everybody knows that. Why would we bother to write it down? And then we're like, oh, like the two people, or like the people that had that particular skill set and background, they all knew it. The other people in the room had related backgrounds. Nope, new to us.
Yeah, even amongst the team, you know, that was true, right? We found that we would assume that each other knew something, and so Eric and I would be like, oh, let's not put that in. That just everybody knows that. We don't need to write that down. And then we'd talk about it a little bit, and they'd be like, oh, yeah, that is kind of interesting. Or it's very red teamy, right? I don't know if I've seen an adversary do that. I wonder what that would look like. And so we constantly having those conversations. And there were still things that didn't make the cut, right, left on the floor. I think, you know, Adam's kind of mentioned that there's still kind of a barrier of what we need to decide what should really be in there and what is that kind of real adversary tactic versus kind of just wild theories and things that you may never actually see in the wild. And we do need to make sure it doesn't blow up into some massive thing. So those discussions happening as well, I think kind of made it something that people could still get their arms around. It's big, but people can still get their arms around and consume it from many different kind of work roles. And I think that has added value to a lot of people and kind of kept its legs. And then I have to mention one more, Katie. I think the community involvement is a key thing. And, you know, this is something you guys may not know, but it was designed that way from the beginning. Eric and I knew there's no way we're going to capture everything, right, of all these attack techniques and things that people could do. And we wanted that from the very beginning. We wanted it to be crowdsourced. We wanted to kind of jumpstart it, but we absolutely knew the community had to be a part of it. And I think, you know, to Blake's point, MITRE continuing to facilitate that in a really strong way, not just kind of every now and then, let me jump in, really kind of facilitating that. But then the community involvement, I think, is the only reason that it continues to be successful and will continue to be successful.
We saw that, I think, on the slide. What was it, like 4-point font? And I think it's an interesting dichotomy, right? Like all these contributions. I know when I was on the team, it was a challenge, and it was wonderful to get the contributions. But then I think what I'm hearing is the importance of saying no sometimes. Hey, this isn't something a red team or an adversary is doing, and right, that protection is an important role, not an easy one.
Yeah, I think one of the first contributions we got was exfiltration of our power lines, which was not quite medium.
Interesting. I'll be looking if anyone has an example of adversaries doing that. You can talk to Blake after.
Yep.
So I think one of the things that's so interesting about having you all here is that, right, you started this wonderful attack thing, and then you've since departed MITRE. And I'm curious if anything has changed, your views on attack, or how have your perspectives changed since leaving MITRE? Blake, start with you.
I would say I have a lot more appreciation for it and the work that we put into it. Seeing it from the outside and seeing like how much a big organization like Microsoft has actually adopted it internally, like it was quite impressive to see.
Absolutely. Specifically for my time at Sony, I think is the same thing, a real appreciation. I had some ideas of how to use it with my sponsors and things at MITRE, doing some mapping and overlaying and that type of thing. But I think for me, going and doing a red team report and being able to, use it in a couple of ways. Use it to design a red team assessment, I think was one, you know, picking some techniques ahead of time and trying to emulate specific adversaries and things like that. But then on the backside, you know, again, going back to that, you kind of assume sometimes that people know everything, but then we talked to the SOC and they had never seen that particular technique before, or the SOC analyst that happened to pick up the tickets that were around your work had seen, one or two privilege escalations, but they'd never seen that particular one. So being able to have a framework that you could communicate really easily, set it down, and not train necessarily, but just communicate very well between those analysts and then up the chain as well. I found it very powerful to have that framework for that. And so I think that was pretty big for me.
Yeah, I love the learning aspect, right? When I'm teaching for SANS, I'll be like, hey, if you don't know what a scheduled task is, right, the internet is a vast thing, but go to ATT&CK, right? Read about it, look at the examples. So maybe that wasn't the original intent, but I think that's a great kind of byproduct, bringing new people in.
I will say, +1 for that. We did that for operators coming in that on the offensive side, even that hadn't seen all of these techniques. It was kind of a way to set up a training plan for them as well and say, well, are all these familiar to you? If they're not, pick one or two, go study them, come back to me and tell me what you learned about them, and if you think we should work them into any assessments or anything. Yeah, absolutely. I think there is and can be a training element that can be built off of this as well.
I love the democratization of the knowledge, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's honestly surreal what happened with it. I don't think we could have done this at a different organization. MITRE is a unique entity, and I really don't think any other organization it would have survived, or it would have been adopted especially as wildly and as widely as it has been by the community. And then the quality control, that we made a conscious choice to enforce, gives it that more authoritative air, if that makes sense, because it's not anyone that spends time doing this and reading blogs or white papers or things like that knows you have a mental ranking of the sourcing of those based on the quality of the research when you read it. And you kind of rack and stack mentally the ones that you prioritize and you believe, and the ones that you just basically throw out. And if you bother to read, you kind of giggle and you're like, oh boy, that was awful. Or you read it and you see, and you can pick out some errors where you're like, I see where they were going with that, but there's a bunch of just issues with this, like logical errors, fallacies in some of the logic that was drawn. So then, and when you see that, when it's made it through the QC process, then you also know, okay, there's problems at that organization right now somewhere within their research organization or QC process. So you discount those, or you don't actually use them until you verify them yourself, or someone else that you trust has verified them. And not having to do that makes life so much easier. Just you can take them, you're like, all right, and you're excited for them at that point. At least I am, because all right, I'm going to learn something now. This is something that is going to teach me something. And I want to read it, and then I want to take that information and go play with it in the sources that I have. So that's been fun. And honestly, at this point, I've kind of gotten used to it. But for a while, I was kind of weirded out when I'd go to do some sort of presentation or speak at some sort of event, and there'd be people there that are like, oh, wow, I learned about that in X class. And at this point, I think the lowest I've heard is high school. And they're like, oh, it's such an honor to meet you. And I'm like, like, who? Me? Like, no. Like, this is strange. But yeah, because people like it that much. And I think you're really lucky if you have any time in your life where you work on something where it makes people feel lucky to have met you. It's a weird feeling. It's a great feeling, but it's really strange.
Yeah, that hits me too. It's a good feeling to create something that's useful to people.
Yeah.
Like, what a rewarding thing in life. Yeah, that's hard to follow. But Eric, how have your views kind of shifted since leaving MITRE?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll sort of second Jen's comment around MITRE and my appreciation for them continuing to sort of carry this on. It's a heavy, a large undertaking to be able to keep something like this in a format that's usable by the community. It'd be very easy to watch it just, expand and end up being something just too confusing to ever really tap into. And I also think just generally it's great to be able to, as you're dealing with a security community, have a common language. So, seeing that continue on and be so widely adopted again has been really helpful in so many aspects of the job.
Yeah, thinking about the adoption, I'd love to hear from you all a little bit about use cases, maybe that you've had in your recent roles or that you've seen, and we can also include maybe some not so great use cases. There are a ton of good ones, maybe some less than ideal ones as well. So, anyone have a use case they want to kick off with?
I'll jump in.
Go for it.
So I think the framework's great to be able to take a security program, get some idea of coverage, say, are we doing okay? What do we have to worry about? Are there certain threats that we really lack coverage entirely? How do we tackle that? You have vendors out there telling you that they have coverage for some of these things.
100%.
I guess on the negative side, I've also heard of other organizations solely measuring their security effectiveness by the framework. And I think that's a real risk, right? Being able to say, hey, we have full coverage of the attack framework, that's really a fallacy at the end of the day, right? Sub-techniques, you can't get deep enough into this to say that you have full coverage of any one of these techniques. You can say you have, pretty good feeling around it and that you think you can cover it, but bad guys are always going to invent new ways to do some of these things. So, relying solely on this as your maturity, I think, is a danger, but I think it's a great starting point.
Yeah, fair points. Other use cases?
Totally agree about it's kind of gone off the rails with its use cases, and it's now being used for things that we definitely never intended it be used for, and it's not an accurate use case. It's, to Eric's point, it's a good thing to use as an educational tool and to figure out how, if you have problems, and to focus on them. But just as we all know, and it is something that has frustrated people in the community, it's a living entity. It changes all the time because software changes, adversaries change. And that means it's not a static document. There is no time ever where you can use it and say, oh, that's good. We are 100% covered because we can do this based on this. No, that means that you're, like to Eric's point, you're in a good spot, probably depending, honestly, on how you interpret it when you decide to apply it incorrectly. But you're setting yourself up for failure by doing it that way. The people that are using it as an educational tool and to inform them, and then kind of going along and understanding that you never stop investing in cybersecurity. I know this is a challenge for a lot of people that aren't technical and for boards, because I've also had to argue for funding for things. But you never stop. You spent $5 million 2 years ago. Great, you're spending 10 this year. Next year you might spend 20 because something really large has changed. It's not something you ever get to and be like, all right, we're done. We can get rid of those people. We can invest our money somewhere else. No, this stays a sunk cost forever. And I think a lot of organizations, they haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah, and I think that's a positive, right? Jared talked about the updates, right? I know my team, when there are updates, we go in, what's changing, right? So remember, you can't just stop, like we've solved the attack coverage, like cool, always changing. So Blake, Brad, other use cases you've seen or you've applied yourself?
So I'll talk about not necessarily a use case for attack, but the process of building attack and sort of like the foundations of the framework. I thought was really cool was AMIT that was presented a few years ago, where it was they applied the attack sort of like methodology to misinformation and disinformation. I thought that was actually a really cool use case of attack concepts, but not necessarily the attack knowledge base itself.
Yeah, expanding it into different domains. Yeah. A really cool use case. I agree. I was going to mention AMIT.
Yeah, as long as people don't like go off and build attack for washing machines, like I think that's okay.
Hey, if adversaries are hacking IoT washing machines, right? Never say never. In the next 10-year panel, maybe we'll come back to that comment.
Yep. Prove me wrong.
Yeah.
I think for me, I kind of already mentioned it. I think the training aspect was really eye-opening to see the value that it could have, both on the offensive side and the defensive side, being able to train the offensive operators and giving them ideas. I found myself even just reminding myself of things, because there's so much information and you kind of maybe you're stuck somewhere and you're like, oh, what's another way I could do this? And then you're like, Oh yeah, that's right. Because you forget some of the techniques you know, but it just reminds you, that's right, I could do that for C2 or something. Let me try that here or whatever. So I think even as a seasoned operator, it's still a tool just to jog your memory on some things that you have very deep down, but you just need that little reminder. So I think as a training tool and just as a reference on either side, still very powerful.
So none of you have every technique memorized? No?
Nope.
Working on it, though. Well, they'll be quiz later.
We started with 64, so
Yeah.
it's
Back in the day.
It's grown a little bit.
When we started, I was pretty good with all of them, but no, I've got no chance now.
Yeah, I remember I used to talk to some people and they would like spit technique IDs at me like I'd memorize them. I'm like, no, it's talk technique names. I don't have all
Yeah,
these
we do
IDs
not have any of the
memorized.
IDs memorized. If you try and speak that, we were doing that. Ross started doing that as a joke last night, and yeah, we don't know.
Yeah.
IDs are for machines.
Yep.
Technique names are for humans. So reflecting back 10 years later, curious if there's anything that looking back you would do differently. You'd be like, hey, 10 years ago, Eric, Blake, Jen, Brad, maybe do something different. Anything that comes to mind, Blake?
Sub techniques. That should have come a lot sooner. And like I'll point out Ross back there, but there was a project that we called ATT&CK. You remember that?
Sounds like a burger.
Yeah, it was
That's
sort
a
of
good
like
name.
a burger. Yeah, but it was like the foundations of the ideas that led to sub techniques. But yeah, it was like it started and then it sort of like couldn't get off the ground a little bit. And then a couple of years later, we came back and did sub techniques. But yeah, that should have happened a lot sooner.
Are there any cautions on sub techniques? Anyone who felt like when you heard about that, like, I don't know?
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit I wasn't keen on it because I was worried about the bloat factor, right? You think sub techniques, I'm thinking many thousands of techniques coming out, and it was a risk. But I think it's worked out. So to the team's credit, both Blake and Adam and others, it's been an effective tool.
I wasn't even responsible for it. I was gone at that point, but I was feeling the stress of having to logistically organize that. So I think they did a good job. But I was like, what is that even going to look like? It turns into this like linear equation, 3D matrix type, linear algebra type problem, and I couldn't see it visually. So yeah, it was interesting to see how they were able to do that, and now they get the 3 little blue lines.
Well, let's face it, it'd be hard to go on a spreadsheet with.
I know the spreadsheet just doesn't work
Spreadsheet
anymore.
to spreadsheets. Yeah, it was fun. I got to be part of like the initial discussions, right, at MITRE, like, oh, should we do this? And I was like, definitely makes sense. And then I left and went to Red Canary and was released. And they're like, hey, Katie, you came from the attack team. Do you want to like lead the sub technique remapping? And yeah, there were definitely some days I think I kind of swore at us, but hey, past you, make the best decision we can at the time. And it was a lot, but I don't know. I feel even though it was painful, I think it was the right choice. So.
Yeah, I know I had to fight through a lot of like dissenting opinions on if it was worthwhile to do that, but I think it was.
So you come to a consensus. That's how we make things better. Disagree, and then figure it out. Move forward. So one interesting thing, Jen kind of talked about it a little bit with someone being like, it's an honor to meet you. Something that I feel like we don't talk about enough is how has attack affected each of you personally? I can say, right, from my perspective, right, I was working in government SOCs and like, thanks for emailing me, Blake. Really appreciate that. And I was like, oh, get my feet wet. Like the trajectory of my entire career and my entire life changed because of this framework, right? Like I think I'd probably still be hiding in government SOCs, never would have done a talk, never would teach for SANS, never would have met you all, right? And so I'm just curious to hear your reflections on, how has attack affected you personally?
Yeah, definitely the career trajectory. Definitely felt that. But I've said this to a couple of people privately, but I'll say it to everyone here. Like attack is the best and worst thing that ever happened to me. And I'll explain why. So throughout like my childhood career, I've had to deal with anxiety and I didn't realize it was a problem. And attack was really sort of the catalyst that forced me to deal with this. And throughout like a couple of years, I was doing presentations like 3-4 times a week for months on end. And it was torture. It was absolute torture. And it actually wasn't until the first ATT&CKcon where Jen was sort of openly describing some of her experiences with anxiety that actually kicked me to actually get some help about it. And, like a lot of us are introverts. A lot of us have to deal with the stress of public speaking and things like that. but it was like affecting my life pretty significantly. And so I'm super glad that you were open to help me about that, and I'm sharing my experiences with it in case it helps anyone else out there.
Yeah, I think for me, I got a real appreciation for frameworks like this. As you know, I've kind of moved around through my career, and I'm kind of on the defensive side now, and I find myself looking for frameworks that fit the work I'm doing, even if it's not strictly attack. If that doesn't always make sense for what I'm doing, I find myself looking for something to lean on that's similar, because I see the value of that the ability to communicate through that and kind of normalize around that. So I think that's been one thing I've really noticed is seeing the power of having that type of tool, and then leveraging that in anything I'm working on, looking for that, or if it's not there, thinking about how would we create it, who would be the right person to create and maintain it, to realize the challenges of that, and trying to partner on those types of things. So I think that's probably not exactly quite the answer maybe we would think to get here, but for me, that's one thing that settled on my mind about this experience and seeing the value of it within the community.
Love that. Look for opportunities for frameworks in your life. Good takeaway.
Yeah.
I'm kind of similar to Blake, actually, in the best and worst scenario, because it definitely. So when I went from here to Unit 42 at Palo, as that grew, a big component was actually education, and that involved speaking to customers, going to conferences, and speaking to people. And I had done that literally since before I could drink alcohol, because I joined the military young. And I had severe, basically crippling anxiety the entire time. I would turn 12 different colors, and I'm pale, right? So I turn colors easily anyway. And I'd turn red, and I'd get really blotchy, and my voice would shake, and it didn't matter how confident I actually felt. That would always happen. And then the more that happens, the worse it is. Because to Blake's point, like as an introvert who had that, having to stand up in front of people was like the 9th layer of hell for me.
And here you are.
I know, it's the weirdest thing. Now people are like, you're an introvert, you're so extroverted. No, I'm not. I have done so much therapy, and I take medication for it. I actually am I have a assistance dog that's being trained to be a service dog. And I've actually been here, and I didn't bring him because this would have been like, he would have had a great time, but this would not have been a positive training experience for him. Because right now he'd be giggling and like, oh, all the people. But I being here, I recognized, I wish he was ready, like further along, because there are times being here, especially post-COVID. So COVID as an introvert was like the best time ever. I was like, I don't have to leave the house, and no one's going to try and actually force me to leave the house or think there's something wrong with me or be like, think it was weird. And I was just like, all right, this is going to be fun. Because I can literally not leave the house for like a month at a time or longer, and I am perfectly happy and fine. Delivery's great. And that actually made it worse than coming back to it. I remember I was at RSA the first time I did like a massive in-person conference event, and I went to one event afterwards, and I was there for about an hour, and then it kept getting increasingly more people over there, and it finally got to being packed, like typical, usual, like total crush, standing room only, everyone's on top of each other, like you have to fight your way through, we're all standing like this with our drink, like please no one spill it on me, and I could feel a panic attack coming on. I was like, I can't, there's too many people, they're too close, everyone's here. And I had to like get out and leave, and I was fine. But I was just like, ooh, I need like the introvert reintroduction to society, like 10-step plan.
Yeah.
Because I got so back in my comfort zone and so used to it. And even doing things on video, yeah, not at all the same, so much easier. And being in person and just having people be that close, I just couldn't.
Yeah.
And it was weird. Like I'm kind of back to my normal self now.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the attack component almost, forced me to do it. But it wasn't until I was comfortable talking about it, and that's why I talk about it, because so many of us face it.
Yeah.
And I didn't do anything about it for so long because you always feel like there's something wrong with you.
There's nothing wrong with you. And thank you so much, both of you, for sharing that. Mental health is health. Glad we have that conversation. And yeah, thinking about how attack has impacted people's lives, like improving mental health, like what a great impact. Right? Like Eric, I'd love to hear from you. How has attack shaped your mental health, your framework perspective, anything?
Yeah, so I guess I left before it became public. So from the stress and anxiety side, I lucked out maybe from that perspective. I definitely feel some of the anxiety pains, but didn't have to suffer that. I guess from the other side of it, though, I think it really opened my eyes to the ability of a community or a group to be able to come together and come up with different ideas, right? Coming from that red team background, we always sort of made assumptions, like we were saying earlier, and then being able to include Blake and Jen and sort of come up with different ideas and see different approaches to things was really eye-opening. 13 years of red teaming, you sort of get stuck in a way, and I think it's been really useful to continue that forward now, where that collaboration is so important.
So on that note, we'll do one rapid fire, and then I'll ask you all to take a question or two from the audience. So 10 years from now, we all come back on this stage, a little grayer, our backs hurt a little more, but what's your hope for the next 10 years of attack? Just briefly go right down the line, starting with Blake.
I hope that it continues. Like when Todd Whitbold's, early on in the days of attack, he said this is going to be the thing that MITRE is known for a long time.
Wow.
I didn't believe him then, but I think he was right.
Continuing. Brad?
I'm going to go continuing as well. Community contribution. I know I mentioned that earlier, but continuing, I really hope MITRE continues to pour into it, but then also that the community continues to grow it. I didn't get a chance to mention it, but I think the growth into adding things for like Linux and Mac, industrial control systems, mobile, those types of areas, I think we need to continue to grow that. We need to continue to get the experiences that people are seeing out there, because everyone has a different lens in their work role, and get those captured so we can talk about those and communicate that. So continuing, but specifically with a strong community involvement, would be my hope for it.
Yeah, the same. I hope more people adopt it and start sharing, and it in some ways forces their quality control to match what MITRE enforces. I think it'll be good.
Yeah, I can't really add too much to that, right? Just seeing it continue on, be adopted by more of the community, and keeping it controlled such that it's still usable 10 years from now. That's all we can hope for.
Awesome. Well, with 2 minutes left, I'll do a single question. Who's got one? I got a brave hand. I'll repeat it. Gentleman in the beard.
So one of the things you guys that stood out to me about what you guys were talking about was leveraging the framework to educate other analysts. One of the things that it sounds like you said was picking a couple of keys, sort of learning how to detect it. But one of the things that I'm most terrified about is mid-incident. I don't know what I don't know. What is a good way to leverage the framework with the information that I have in front of me to figure out what it is I'm doing?
Interesting. So repeating the question, talking about attack as an educational tool, what's a good way, it's kind of intimidating to kind of use attack, right, in an educational way, diving into it. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that's where we kind of saw that angle, was when we were having those conversations, either mid-incident, hopefully red team, not actual incident, but you can't control that part of it. But mid-incident, I think you probably have maybe some senior analysts that have more experience on some of them. So partnering senior analysts, or maybe if you don't, using that attack framework to look at what were other attacks that have happened, using the threat intelligence data, which is why it was so key to add that element in, reviewing that threat intelligence data, looking at those reports, seeing how it played out, what happened, where did they go from there, and then trying to understand, how that attack happens and all the reference data there. There was some mention, Adam mentioned, needing to maybe refreshing, but the CAR, the analytics repository stuff as well, and trying to find out, jump starting how you can use the tooling you have to hunt those types of things down. There were some great talks already about, which things are really detectable and which aren't. So I think, kind of harnessing those elements. So even if you can't solve it in that moment, getting better and preparing for it for the next time around, and showing that growth out of the incident and having some positive out of the incident, I think would be a good way.
Great.
I think red teaming and atomic red team and other things like that, even trying to emulate some of the threats to see what they look like, is a good way to train yourself as well.
Yeah, I think understanding like how an attacker would chain the techniques together into a sequence, because you might miss one part of it because maybe there's a new technique or something, but you'll find something else, and you can relate it to whatever you're missing through like the same process or the same user account that was compromised, and you can look at the activity that way to figure out what was missing.
Absolutely.
And collaborate. Find some other people that have a different viewpoint or skill set than yours, or if you can, find someone elsewhere in the community and reach out and just ask. That's honestly how we did it.
Ask, learn, collaborate, right? Great note to end on. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists, Eric, Jen, Brad, and Blake.